Welcome to the Lord's Day service for March 31st, 2024. This is Easter Sunday. I'll start by reading a couple of pieces of scripture. First, a reading from Psalm 114. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. When Israel went out from Egypt, the house of Jacob from a people of strange language, Judah became God's sanctuary, Israel his dominion. The sea looked and fled, Jordan turned back, the mountains skipped like rams and hills like lambs. Oh, is it, O sea, that you flee, O Jordan, that you turn your back, O mountains, that you skip like rams, O hills like lambs, tremble, O earth, at the presence of the Lord, at the presence of the God of Jacob, who turns the rock into a pool of water and the flint into a spring of water. And our next reading is from Mark. Now, this is the account of the resurrection of Mark, and it's the earliest and briefest of the accounts. Hear what the Spirit's saying to the church. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early in the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw the stone. It was very large, had already been rolled back. And they entered the tomb, and they saw a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting at the right side. And they were alarmed, but he said to them, "Don't be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he's going ahead of you to Galilee, where you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and they fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. These are the words of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now I was standing next to a concrete pillar, straining to hear, and it was Easter Sunday, and the church sanctuary was overflowing, and the air was thick and stifling, warm with body heat. But the concrete was cool and soothing, and I remember how full my heart felt then. I didn't know what was happening inside of me. I don't know why I was alone on that day. I think I was maybe about 13 or 14 years old, so it really wasn't unusual for me to split off from my parents. Now, all of my siblings are much older than I am, so they were all long gone, off to college and careers and their own lives. My folks were probably seated somewhere in their usual spot in that sanctuary on that day, but I was a million miles away. I was tucked off into the corner of the church that I grew up in, and it's a massive building. It's a very large church, and it probably seats about 2,000 people. And I was stuck off to the side next to the concrete pillar. As an active youth group kid, I knew that place very well. I sang in the choir. I was friends with the pastor's kids, so we would fool around and look into the back rooms. That church building was very familiar. The church building had a soaring stained glass window and a giant pipe organ. Several years later, my wife and I would be married in that place. Yet on that Easter Sunday, we were surrounded by people. I was surrounded by people, but I was all alone. The pastor, Reverend George Munzing, had a big booming voice, and he wore that black Geneva robe, that robe that was so popular among pastors in those days, the big black robe. And then suddenly he would lift up his arms while preaching, and he looked like a giant bat ready for takeoff. It was all so familiar, but that Sunday was different. What struck me that Sunday was the strangeness of the Easter story. The three women, Mary Magdalene, Mary, mother of James, and Salome, saw the young man in the tomb, and he told them Jesus was gone. He has been raised. And they fled. For terror and amazement had seized them. They said nothing, for they were afraid. This is the way the Gospel of Mark ends. It's the earliest Gospel. And now, sure, there are other bits there after this, but all of those things were added centuries later. They're not part of the original Gospel. So the original Gospel ends like this, and it leaves us on edge. I don't know what got into me on that Sunday 5 decades ago, but I was astounded too. My eyes were watering. I gasped for breath. I had seen the empty tomb. Now, like lots of things in the Bible, we become far too accustomed with the Easter story. Our ability to see new things, especially new points of view in Scripture, get harder and harder as we get older. As children, it seeped into our being, and it's become so much a part of our mental furniture, we don't see how strange it really is. The version of Jesus that we've grown up with has become too familiar. This is the reason why I like the Mark account of the resurrection so much. Unlike the other Gospels, it's not neat and clean, it's not as buttoned up. When we are true to the text, as I said, it's really a cliffhanger. It sends us off into space without a parachute. What do we do with this? It gives us an opportunity to build the resurrection narrative with our own lives, to fill it with our own lives from that point forward. Now, Psalm 114, which I read, seems a little out of place in this week's lectionary, but it's there to remind us that Jesus was a Jew and that his legacy was Judah, where Jerusalem is. By ancestry, Jesus was Judean, but by culture and upbringing, he was a Nazarene. Now, while nominally both are Jewish peoples, their cultures are very different. They spoke different language. Now, it was mutually intelligible. It was the same overall language, but they really didn't understand each other. They were so different. So Jesus was a foreigner in his own land. He wasn't really a Jew or a Judean, and he wasn't really a Galilean. Galilee is where Nazareth is. Now, I've met many people who feel this way, that in-betweenness, the strangeness in their own land. It's the great joy of having immigrants and people with a variety of different backgrounds in our lives. It's that in-betweenness that these people feel, that these people in our neighborhoods, the people that we know so well, but they give us a fresh perspective. When we hear the Easter story with fresh ears, it's like listening to a strange language. What makes it so strange? How can this story still give us goosebumps and bring us tears even after hearing it 100 times? It's because it's so implausible. It's because how can God become a human with all of the uncleanliness and imperfection of being human? How can God of the universe be crucified on a cross? How can creation be recreated by resurrection? About 18 years after my encounter with the empty tomb in the crowded sanctuary, I was in a very different place. I was all alone. My life had changed these many years later. I had gone to college, there's marriage, career, kids. And this time I was on a business trip. I was buying a piece of factory production equipment in Germany. And I was sent there. It was part of my job. I was sent there to qualify the piece of equipment before it would be shipped to the United States. And it was the trip of a lifetime. I had never been overseas before. It was, foreign language. I was there pretty much by myself. There was different food. There was different money. Everything was different. And I was only 30 years old. So this was really cool. And I had to stay the weekend there. So instead of just staying put in the town where the company was, I rented a car and I took off for the weekend. And I went to Austria, about an hour and a half or so drive away, and I drove the length of Highway A12, which goes from Switzerland to Innsbruck in Tyrol. And if you know that area, sort of the western part of Austria in the Alps. And I was stunned by its beauty, and I've never seen anything like it in person before. It was, all those little towns, with their little churches, and they were hanging on the cliffs and where the green hills are, and you could see the cows with their big clanking bells around their necks. And in fact, I put a photo of a church in a town that's along this route in the bulletin this week. And I happen to have with me a cassette tape of Enya, and I popped that into the stereo. And I remembered that otherworldly feeling that I had. And I felt that Easter Day, that Easter Day feeling that I had years before. Everything was so strange and heavenly at the time. Now, during the service, I will play the Shepherd Moons, which is the first song on Enya's album, Shepherd Moons, if you're familiar with it. It's really beautiful, kind of an otherworldly sound. And while it's playing, I'm going to ask people to think of an otherworldly moment themselves. Think of one of their own, because we've all had these moments. Something that makes you feel perpetually new. Something that is like that beautiful place that you've seen that in the picture. Maybe it's a feeling like that feeling when you first fell in love. Or maybe it's that big aha moment. Or maybe when you saw a vision of God. Whatever that is, take a moment and let it touch your heart again. Now, every time I feel that heavenly feeling like I did when I played this song, I've always wanted it to stay. I wanted to grab onto it and hold on to it. The funny thing is that I've been back to that pillar in that church, and it's a very nice memory, but I don't have the same feeling when I see it. I've been to the Alps several times. I actually lived nearby there for a little while, and so I got to see it quite a bit since 1993 when I first saw them. And they're stunningly beautiful, and I'm awestruck every time I see them, but it's not the same out of time, out of body feeling that I had back then. And I've wondered why this is. Why is it that things like this become too familiar, and they don't have the same impact on us anymore? Why can't we see things that are different like this, see them differently all the time? We can remember those feelings, but we're not transformed in the same way. A lot of it has to do with old familiar language. It's something that becomes part of, as I said, that mental furniture. And we try to take that strange language of resurrection, and we tame it, and we control it, and we capture it, and we also make it also familiar in this way. The trouble with our Christianity is that we forget the strangeness of the Jesus story, and we try to make it into a logical system. We tame it, control it, and capture it. We've replaced the bravery of Jesus. We've replaced the inclusion of Jesus. We have replaced the compassion of Jesus. We have replaced the self-sacrifice and gentle kindness of Jesus. We've replaced it with a system of salvation. And we've made it into an escape hatch for only those who are in the know, who know what to do, said that prayer, and we've made Jesus a weapon against our enemies. What happened? The familiar language says that if you don't toe the line, you don't do what the church says, if you've rejected the church, which many have, maybe you have, all too often you'll hear, "You were never really a Christian." The familiar language says that we're only saved by the grace of God. That's very true. It's good. But like Pharisees, many Christians then will demand your obedience and threaten your salvation and say it's at risk if you don't follow the rules. They will personalize sin and morality. They will ignore justice. They will say that you have to act a certain way, that you have to vote a certain way, you have to be the right kind of person and have the right kind of family. But compassion and empathy, be damned. The empty tomb must be filled full of stuff in order to make it for us to be comfortable in our Christianity today. Resurrection has been tamed and controlled. Soon, after this worship service, or after this sermon, we will sing, "We Are One in the Spirit." It's one of the great songs of my youth. Sometime around that time when I stood next to the pillar in the sanctuary. And it has a famous line. It says, "And they will know we are Christians by our love. By our love, they will know we are Christians by our love." For so many people, this line has become a joke. Are Christians today known for their love? Really? It seems that for many, that old familiar language has become stale. Now, the irony of this is that song comes from the civil rights movement. In 1966, a black minister in South Side of Chicago wrote it, and it became a rallying cry for nonviolence and justice. It was brought into the church in this spirit, and it harkens back to a time when Christians were the only ones who risked their lives to save the poor, the starving, the sick, and the enslaved during the Roman Empire. Compassion was not the standard in that society, as it has many times in the past. It's not been the standard to be compassionate. Whenever plague came in the Roman Empire, rich Romans would flee, but it was the Christians who would stay behind. And this perplexed the Romans. It was a strange language they didn't understand. In 1 Corinthians 15, it says that the risen Jesus appeared to hundreds, then to James, and then the apostles, and then finally to Paul. James was the brother of Jesus, and he wasn't anywhere to be found at the crucifixion. He was leaving Mary, his mother, there without him, and the only apostle that would care for Mary would be John. Jesus' own brother would later become the leader of the Jerusalem church, and he would become a martyr of the faith, but he wouldn't be there when he was needed. It would take a while for all of the apostles to participate in Jesus' death and resurrection fully. Only the women were there at first. As I've grown older, I have had more heavenly visions. I've had that feeling once again. But instead of full sanctuaries and beautiful mountains that captivated me in my youth, I now see it in the eyes of people. On another business trip around 10 years ago, when I was first contemplating going into the ministry, it happened again. But it was really different this time. When you spend a lot of time alone, as I often did on business trips, things happen in your mind. That's why I mentioned them. This time I was in Las Vegas. and things weren't going well. I was at a sales conference, and a sales conference is not a place of high morals. And I just felt like I had to leave. So during the break, I left the hotel and I decided to walk up and down the strip, looking for the face of Jesus in people. I was very intentional to look in their eyes for a split second at a time, person after person after person. And as I walked along, and I was in a place that, where bad behavior, greed, shallowness is the norm, right? And I'm watching people, you're seeing people acting out their foolishness all around you. But I was amazed at what I saw in their eyes. What I saw was the beloved. I saw joy. I saw sorrow. I saw friendliness. I saw suspicion. I saw eyes that were searching, and I saw eyes that were filled with stories of love and loneliness. And then I saw myself as I looked at them. I saw all the prejudices I had about those people that I had in my own heart. And I realized I was hearing the familiar language of judgment and division and even hate. When I realized that I could reject it in that moment, I realized I could leave it behind and I could become acquainted with the strange language of love again. The strange language of unconditional love is resurrection. But instead of all the rationalizations and systematic reasons for why Jesus died, instead of reaching for the triumphal glory of Jesus' return, as we often do, instead of grasping for a new high, I recognize that resurrection is really just an empty tomb. Strange, uncertain, like the fleeing women running off into the unknown, finding newness in the most unexpected places, being resurrected every day in the eyes of another human being, seeing their humanity and seeing the face of Jesus in them. Can you do that with me today? Can you give up on the old familiar language that you have, the old narrative? Can you come into the land of a strange new language? Are you willing to step out into the strangeness of resurrection again? Let us pray. God of strange places, God of strange feelings and strange words, show us that we don't have to cling to the familiar ways. We can embrace the new. Instead of capturing Jesus and making him our own, we can be resurrected with him. We can gaze into the empty tomb and be changed forever. With the witness of the Holy Spirit on our hearts, we pray. Amen.